Hey guys, tonight we're going to uncover a dark secret of the Tudor dynasty. King Henry VIII defied everyone, destroyed religious order, and executed two of his wives in his desperate quest for a male heir. In 1537, when Prince Edward VI was born, the entire kingdom was overjoyed. But very soon after, that hope turned into a horror, a secret that even the top physicians were powerless to stop. This video will take you back to the damp hallways and lavish rooms of the Tudor palaces, where a young boy king became a living corpse right before everyone's eyes. We will explore suppressed medical records, forbidden testimonies, and top-secret diplomatic letters to decipher why Edward's body rotted while he was still alive. This is not just a story of death, but also the downfall of a great dynasty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please comment below to let me know where you are and what the local time island. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the summer of 1553, the air in Greenwich Palace had already turned heavy with the scent of decay long before Edward VI drew his final breath. Courtiers and visitors alike entered the royal chambers gingerly, holding handkerchiefs to their noses against the overpowering stench that seeped from the still-living body of the 15-year-old king. He lay upon his opulent bed, his flesh, a battlefield of festering wounds and swollen limbs, a tragic embodiment of Henry VIII's desperate quest for a secure dynasty. The very heir whom the king had fought so fiercely to obtain breaking with Rome and executing two queens in the process had become a living horror show, his body at war with itself. Edward's arrival into the world on October 12, 1537, had been celebrated across England, with bonfires lighting the night sky and church bells tolling in joyous symphony. Henry wept tears of gratitude, convinced that the long-awaited male heir would finally cement the Tudor succession. Yet from the moment of his birth, Edward carried within him the seeds of a body destined for betrayal. By his final days, medical accounts recorded ulcers gnawing through skin, oozing foul-smelling pus that stained the finest linens of his canopy bed. His lungs, ravaged by what modern physicians recognize as tuberculosis, had liquefied in places, forcing him to cough up chunks of decaying tissue mixed with blood. His legs had ballooned to twice their normal circumference, the skin so taut that it split open, unveiling raw, rotting flesh beneath. Despite the undeniable evidence of his suffering, his hair falling out in mangled clumps, his fingernails turning black and detaching court proclamations stubbornly proclaimed that the young king was on the mend. Ambassadors requesting access to offer condolences were rebuffed with false reports of recovery, and any courtier daring to whisper the truth faced swift punishment or exile. A grotesque theatre of denial unfolded. Edward's physicians, some of the most respected in England, were instructed to publicize optimistic assessments, even as they witnessed the boy's relentless decline in private. The tragic irony was that the physical decay of the monarch was matched only by the moral decay of the state apparatus determined to conceal it. When Edward finally exhaled his last, the post-mortem examination revealed horrors that even seasoned Tudor surgeons found appalling. His liver, once a deep mahogany hue, had turned a sickly yellow-green, crumbling at the gentlest touch. The heart, symbol of royal vigor, was grotesquely enlarged and peppered with lesions. His lungs, or what remained of them, held vast cavities filled with putrid fluid that poured forth like foul wine when the chest cavity was opened. These findings were documented in secret letters and coded diplomatic correspondence, penned by Sir John Heywood years later, when it was safer to speak candidly. He described Edward's skin as having shifted to an unearthly shade of green in his final weeks, and recounted how servants replaced his bedding multiple times a day as bodily fluids leaked relentlessly. Throughout these final agonies, Edward remained fully conscious of his condition. Contemporary memoirs recall how he would gaze around his chamber with hollow eyes, as if astonished that a world so grand could be so indifferent to his suffering. Even so, his presence continued to serve the interests of those around him. While the boy's ravaged body lay ensconced in silk and velvet, courtiers whispered and plotted over succession, ready to pounce the moment the throne was vacated. In this grim dance of power and decay, the true cost of Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir was laid bare, not only in the death of a child, but in the corruption of an entire realm that chose illusion over compassion, And so, as the sun set on Greenwich Palace for the last time in Edward's short life, the sweet promise of Tudor glory had soured into a rancid testament to human frailty. The 15-year-old king, once hailed as England's great hope, now lay exposed to history as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the most formidable throne cannot shield its occupant from the inexorable march of disease and the tragic consequences of political ambition unchecked. Edward VI had once been the great hope of the Tudor dynasty. Every birthday celebration, every baptism ceremony, every coronation pomp rivaled the grandeur of his father's own coronation. The court gathered in jubilant procession, trumpets blared through the palace corridors, and church bells tolled for days on end. Yet even in those first ecstatic moments, a dark portent took root. Jane Seymour, his beloved mother, succumbed to puerperal fever just 12 days after giving birth. The lavish baptism feast and the resplendent birthday revels could not banish the shadow of her untimely passing. Henry VIII, grief-stricken and fearful for his only son, decreed a regimen of near-obsessive cleanliness. He ordered weekly purifications of Edward's chambers, walls washed with lime to ward off disease, garlands of vinegar and rose petals burned in braziers to fumigate the air. All who approached the young prince, nurses, tutors, pages, or ambassadors, had to wash their hands in scented rosewater, lest they carry a stray germ into his sterile sanctuary. This bubble around the boy king created an environment so rigorously antiseptic that it inadvertently stunted the natural development of his immune system. Isolated from ordinary childhood exposures, Edward's fragile body lacked the chance to build defences against common pathogens. In 1541, at the tender age of 4, Edward fell gravely ill with a quartan fever likely to have been malaria. He was bedridden, and so weakened that his tiny frame lay limp beneath the finest linens. Henry's rage at his son's suffering was swift and terrifying. He dismissed several physicians and threatened execution for any who failed to restore the prince's health. Though Edward rallied after days of torment, the illness left him permanently weakened. He grew pale and easily fatigued. Simple Latin lessons, hours astride a pony, or a casual game of courtly tennis would leave him breathless and trembling. Over the following years, Edward endured recurrent respiratory infections and painful skin rashes that left lasting marks on his delicate flesh. Secret dispatches from foreign ambassadors, hidden away in coded correspondence, detailed episodes of pneumonia, bouts of chronic diarrhea, and a persistent state of malnutrition that no royal diet could cure. Each new illness chipped away at his youthful vigour, yet the Tudor propaganda machine continued to present the facade of a thriving monarch, his pale cheeks rouged by carefully applied cosmetics, his wind-tousled hair artfully arranged to conceal any sign of wasting. When Edward ascended the throne at the age of 9, in 1547, the splendour of his coronation was tempered by his own frailty. The ceremony, customarily a lengthy display of regal pageantry, was curtailed because the boy could not bear the weight of the heavy crown for more than a few minutes. He was borne aloft in a gilded chair by steadfast nobles, their arms trembling under the extra burden. Courtiers, anxious to avoid public panic, discreetly coached one another on how to support Edward's swaying figure during the procession. Portrait artists were instructed to pose him standing tall, shoulders squared, despite the necessity of hidden supports and strategically placed cushions. Even the act of signing royal decrees became a spectacle of his physical decline. His little hand, swollen and stiff from edema, gripped the quill so precariously that the ink often pooled and smudged across the parchment. Witnesses later described the prince's quivering signature, the letters sprawling into an almost indecipherable scrawl, a painful testament to his deteriorating strength. Yet the official records dutifully proclaimed the clarity and firmness of the king's hand, as though ink blots and tremors were mere artistic stylings of a youthful monarch in command. Throughout these years of enforced seclusion and medical intervention, Edward remained acutely aware of the gap between the public image and his private suffering. In his diaries, snippets of which survive in cloistered archives, he wrote of feeling like a relic under glass, admired by thousands yet never truly known or understood. Tutors recorded that he would drift off during lessons, his thoughts wandering to the solemn hush of the healer's chambers, where faint echoes of coughing and the hiss of steam from herbal remedies filled the air. Despite the vigilant regimen of baths in rose water and nightly ritual anointings with aromatic oils, Edward's body continued to betray him. The very measures intended to protect him had robbed his immune defences of the chance to mature. As he navigated the delicate politics of a kingdom still learning to accept a child king, his physical fragility became inseparable from the realm's stability. Each wheezing breath he drew, each feverish night he endured, cast a shadow over the Tudor cause. By the late 1540s, courtiers whispered that Edward's health had never been robust, that the trials of his early childhood had set a course no doctor could reverse. Yet in public, he remained the youthful sovereign, robed in crimson velvet and gold embroidery, his soft voice echoing through vast hallways as he issued commands with regal composure. The illusion held firm, a testament to the court's determination, and perhaps to their fear that acknowledging Edward's weakness might unravel the fragile tapestry of Tudor rule altogether. Thus, in the years following his coronation, Edward VI stood at the centre of a dual reality, a figure of resplendent authority in the eyes of his subjects, and a frail child, quietly battling the very pathogens the court could neither admit nor conquer. His reign, though brief, became an enduring example of how the highest honours and the greatest vulnerabilities can coexist in the same fragile body, especially when the weight of a kingdom rests upon a child's shoulders. In 1550, Edward VI was struck down by a devastating smallpox-like illness, most likely a severe strain of chickenpox or measles that covered his body in painful pustules and left him delirious with fever. His once fair skin erupted in clusters of red and white blisters, each one a tiny furnace of inflammation burning into his flesh. Overwhelmed by waves of high fever and chills, the young king slipped in and out of consciousness for days on end. When at last he awakened, the telltale scars of pockmarks marred his once smooth complexion, a permanent reminder of his struggle. His joints swelled painfully, the weight of inflammation pinning him to the bed, and each breath seemed a laborious task as blood streaked his coughing spasms. During this fraught illness, the power dynamic at court reached a simmering boil. Two factions, the supporters of the Lord Protector Somerset and those of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, vied for influence over the kingdom's destiny. Both men understood that Edward's life hung by a slender thread, and that the slightest shift in the boy king's fate would tilt the balance of power irrevocably. As Edward writhed in agony, Somerset attempted to consolidate control by promoting his own allies to key positions, while Northumberland moved in the shadows, forging alliances with the Privy Council and whispering promises to those who would back his claim to guide the realm. In the end, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, emerged triumphant. He maintained a pall of secrecy around Edward's near-fatal condition, ensuring that news of the prince's dire health would not undermine his regime. Official bulletins continued to speak of the king's gradual improvement, even as he lay feverish and frail behind closed doors. This facade allowed Northumberland to wield de facto authority over government affairs, issuing proclamations and managing finances while Edward's weakened hand was coaxed to sign the necessary documents. The young sovereign, isolated and vulnerable, became a mere instrument of statecraft, his body a vessel through which political ambitions flowed. During these harrowing days, Edward kept a personal journal in which he confessed that he felt like a prisoner within these gilded walls. He wrote of his trembling limbs and hollow stomach, of his despair at being reduced to a political pawn rather than a living child. The entries, preserved in fragments by loyal attendants, reveal a psyche worn thin by pain and captivity. He spoke of nights filled with fever dreams, where shadows morphed into spectres of his own mortality. He longed for the ease of anonymity, to run barefoot in the palace gardens, or play simple games with other children, pleasures forever denied by the pinnacles of power and the fragile fortress of his own body. By 1552, foreign ambassadors dispatched coded reports back to their courts. They described a young king gaunt and hollow-cheeked, his eyes sunken and encircled by dark rings. Veins crisscrossed his pale skin like delicate blue rivers beneath a winter ice sheet. His hand, gaunt and quivering, could scarcely hold a quill. To preserve the illusion of regal composure, cushions were artfully arranged to prop him upright during council sessions, and portraitists laboured to depict him in healthier postures, draping heavy cloaks around his shoulders to conceal any hint of emaciation. Rumours began to swirl of foul play that Edward might have been poisoned by those who feared his potential recovery would threaten their grip on power. Yet the true culprits of his relentless decline were the combined ravages of tuberculosis, chronic kidney failure, and systemic anasarca. The prince's body had succumbed to fluid accumulation in the tissues and abdomen, his belly distended like a waterlogged drum. His chest, weighed down by ascites, rose and fell with each breath, the effort visible in the stretched skin across his ribs. Contemporary physicians, constrained by the limitations of 16th century medicine, could only offer poultices and bloodletting treatments that often exacerbated his frailty. Despite his debilitated state, Edward continued to perform his royal duties as best he could. He attended council meetings in a specially designed gilded chair, his frail voice whispering assent to the policies Northumberland laid before him. He made occasional appearances during public ceremonies, his figure gaunt beneath rich velvets and silks, as courtiers murmured assurances to one another that the king remains in fair health. Behind the scenes, however, his personal physicians worked tirelessly, administering aromatic waters and herbal decoctions in desperate hope of alleviating his suffering. In his private moments, Edward reflected on the irony of his position. Protected as a fragile reed in a tempest, he found himself caught between the twin storms of illness and intrigue. His diary entries mention the soft rustle of silk curtains and the hush of candle flames as he lay in his bedchamber. Listening to the distant clatter of armor in the corridors, reminders that the kingdom's fate spun on the axis of his own weakness. He lamented the isolation imposed by his condition, the absence of childhood camaraderie, the loss of simple joys. Somerset, once the guiding force behind Edward's early reign, fell from grace when his enemies linked him to supposed plots. He was arrested and convicted of high treason, paving the way for Northumberland's undisputed ascendancy. Edward's physical and political isolation deepened as he watched from his sickbed, largely unable to intervene in the machinations swirling around him. His body became a symbol of Tudor vulnerability, an illustration of how a dynasty could be both exalted and endangered by the frailty of its heir. Through it all, the young king remained dignified in his fragility. Guests who visited his chamber described him as composed, though pale and diminished. He would muster a gentle nod or a brief greeting, careful not to show the distress etched into his features. Yet even these small efforts were taxing, a testament to his lingering resolve. In private, he spoke of his longing for rest and release, of dreams of open fields free from the stifling tapestries and perfumed airs of the palace. Thus, the years 1550 to 1552 stand as a testament to Edward VI's formidable endurance in the face of bodily collapse and political rivalry. His afflictions and the power struggle that surrounded him reveal a rare convergence of personal tragedy and high statecraft. Even as he lay encased in fine fabrics and gilded settings, the young king's true state was a somber reminder that no throne, however ornate, could shield a human life from the inexorable forces of disease and ambition. In the winter of 1552 to 1553, Edward's condition plunged into its most harrowing phase. The tuberculosis that had long ravaged his lungs now spread aggressively into his bones, inflicting a level of pain so intense that even the slightest movement brought tears to his eyes. His spine curved unnaturally under the assault of tubercular lesions, leaving him unable to sit or stand without support. The imprisoned chambers of Whitehall echoed with his laboured breaths, each inhale rattling like a frail bell tolling for his diminishing vitality. Abscesses in his lungs ruptured, releasing a thick, putrid fluid that coated his sheets and stained the tapestries hanging on the chamber walls. A choking miasma of decay permeated the air, forcing attendants to burn aromatic woods and herbs endlessly at the door, though their efforts could scarcely mask the underlying stench of death. Tudor medical practice, with its earnest but misguided zeal, became a theatre of crude interventions. Physicians commanded that Edward be bled regularly to rebalance his humours, drawing pints of precious blood from his frail arms. Blistering plasters, heated until they seared the skin, were applied to his chest in a desperate bid to draw out the evil humours thought to dwell within his lungs. The young king's flesh bore the angry scars of these treatments, red welts crusted with dried serum, painful burns that festered and required constant cleaning. Mercury, antimony, and arsenic compounds were administered in tonics supposed to purge toxins. Instead, they further assaulted his already weakened liver and kidneys. At every turn, the remedies harmed more than they healed, deepening the systemic collapse of his organs. Attendants, their faces hidden by cloth masks soaked in rosewater and vinegar, changed his bedding dozens of times each day, wrestling with sheets soaked through by the oozing secretions. Mattresses became sodden and were replaced with new ones, but each fresh layer would soon succumb to the same relentless drainage, leaving pools of dark, viscous fluid that seeped into the floorboards. Amid this physical torment, the political machinations of the Tudor court reached a fever pitch. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, recognizing that Edward's death was imminent, orchestrated the drafting and signing of the infamous device for the succession. Under Northumberland's watchful eye, the boy king was guided in attempting to bypass his older half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey. The document was drawn on fine parchment, its ink still fresh when Edward was summoned to affix his signature. Observers noted, in shocked, hushed tones, how the prince's once firm hand now trembled violently, his fingers swollen so greatly by edema that he could barely hold the quill. His first signature, though shaky, bore a semblance of purpose, but subsequent attempts degraded into indecipherable scrawls. The ink bled around his knuckles, smudging into blotches that testified to the pressure he exerted in a desperate act of coerced authority. Each stroke of the pen was a betrayal of his own agency, a stark demonstration that his body, and even his will, had become instruments of political ambition. The coup itself was a brittle construct of desperation. Northumberland and his cohort believed that by presenting Jane as the rightful heir, they could control the reins of power once more. Yet every line of the device for the succession bore the imprint of Edward's suffering letters formed in agony rather than authority, signatures so faint they required magnification to read. The realm's nobles whispered that the true instrument in this document was not Edward, but those who manipulated him, and that the fragile page carried more blood of ambition than of the king himself. The boy, who had once been lauded as the future of England, now sat at a small writing desk in his damp chamber, his will broken, forced to validate a scheme that would erase his sisters and entomb his own legacy beneath the ambitions of others. Through it all, only a handful of loyal attendants stood vigil by Edward's bedside nurses and pages whose compassion transcended fear. These few, bound by duty and perhaps genuine affection, were the last witnesses to his final hours. They watched as he drifted in and out of fevered delirium, sometimes screaming for deliverance, sometimes begging for a miracle that never came. On certain nights, his cries pierced the silence of the night guard's shift. "Father, grant me strength," he would moan, his voice hoarse from relentless coughing. At other moments, he would whisper prayers, clutching a worn prayer book to his chest as though it were a lifeline, his eyelids fluttering with visions of his late mother, Jane Seymour, or of the cold stones of Westminster Abbey, where he would soon be laid to rest. In his delirious wanderings, Edward called out for his father, Henry of England, or for his sister Mary, beseeching them for comfort he knew they could not provide. Servants described him reaching out toward empty air, as if the spectre of his destiny hovered just beyond reach. Then, after agonizing hours, he would fall silent, his chest heaving with shallow gasps, until at last the breaths grew fainter and the coughing subsided into haunted stillness. The final moments were witnessed by these faithful few, who later recounted how the candlelight flickered over the boy's pale face, illuminating the deep hollows beneath his eyes. In that dim glow, they saw not a king but a child who had endured too much, sacrificed at the altar of Tudor ambition. By the time dawn broke on that final day of the winter months, the prince's chamber lay draped in mournful shadow. The ritual of courtly mourning was soon to begin. Black banners, sombre laments, and the heavy silence of a realm bereft of its sovereign. Yet those who had cared for Edward in his last hours understood that no official ceremony could truly mark the end of his suffering. His body, ravaged by disease and political betrayal, would soon be sealed away in lead and wood, hidden from public view in a vault untouched by daylight. And in the hush that followed his passing, the only sound would be the faint dripping of condensation from the cold walls, as though the palace itself wept for the boy king who had died alone, a casualty of both illness and intrigue. By the time June of 1553 arrived, Edward's once cherubic frame had diminished to little more than skin stretched over bone. His abdomen still ballooned from ascites, so taut that the slightest movement sent him into spasms of agony. Each breath came in rattling gasps, a ghastly echo through the silent halls that courtiers would later liken to the death rattle of some great beast. His spirit, however, found refuge in prayer. The devout boy drew parallels between his suffering and the trials of Job, convinced that his ordeal was both a divine test and a form of atonement. On one particularly harrowing evening, he confided to his prayer book that he felt drawn closer to God by each pang, as though the physical pain might burn away any lesser attachment. In mid-July, the prince suffered a devastating stroke. His left cheek drooped in grotesque asymmetry, and his left arm hung motionless at his side, utterly paralyzed. The royal physicians, already overwhelmed, watched in horror as the once vigorous boy's features betrayed him. At the sight, one physician renowned for his bold remedies fled the chamber, wrenching the door closed behind him as though he hoped to outrun the spectre of death itself. Those who remained whispered that no marvel of medicine could withstand the relentless march of disease within Edward's frail frame. The stroke, arriving at such a critical juncture, underscored the tragic truth. The boy king was slipping beyond the reach of both science and prayer. Edward's final 5 days were a descent into a nightmare of hemorrhage and decay. Epistaxis, or spontaneous nosebleeds, became so frequent that attendants shook their heads in despair, clutching pillows and cloths to catch the crimson tide. Blood seeped from his gums, trickled from tears at the corners of his eyes, and even oozed from the tiny pores of his skin where capillaries had burst. His body, bruised and mottled, turned a tapestry of purple and black bruises that looked like maps of some unknown territory. Aromatic resins, frankincense, myrrh, and even sulphur were burned ceaselessly in an attempt to mask the overpowering stench of putrefaction, but the smell was so corrosive it ate into the fabric of tapestries and soaked through walls. Guards posted in shifts wore simple linen masks, but even that proved insufficient. Many would faint or vomit in the corridors outside his chamber, forcing replacements every hour. On the morning of July 6th, 1553, Edward drew his last breath. There was no dramatic gasp or whispered farewell, only a gradual easing of his chest's frantic heaving, until it stilled in silent finality. Those who had watched him suffer testified that his passing was almost peaceful in its abruptness, as if the candle of life had been snuffed out rather than allowed to gutter out in a damp draught. Preparations for his funeral at Westminster Abbey had been underway in secret, but the outer ceremony was abruptly cancelled. On August 8th, instead of parading the real coffin for public viewing, the court displayed an empty oak sarcophagus draped in gold cloth, an elaborate ruse to maintain Tudor dignity. Meanwhile, the true body lay hidden in a side chapel, tightly encased in nested coffins of lead, wood, and lead once more. The embalming process had been nothing short of a macabre nightmare. Embalmers found the internal organs in a state of catastrophic decay. The lungs resembled sodden sponges, loaded with foul-smelling fluid. The heart was distended, fibrous adhesions binding it firm. The liver and kidneys had turned to crumbly fragments, impossible to preserve. To stem the relentless odours, vast quantities of spices and resins, nutmeg, cinnamon, and clove, were packed into every available cavity. Linseed oil and pitch were applied liberally to the wooden coffin, creating a seal intended to contain both smell and gas. Despite these efforts, those on the night watch reported faint bup-bup noises, emanating through the stone floor sounds of gas pockets shifting within the sealed chambers. Some whispered that acid fluids oozed through the seams, dribbling onto the flagstones outside, where attendants quietly wiped them away with strips of linen. The court's decision to seal the real coffin so thoroughly was dictated by practicality as much as by scandal. Any public display of Edward's ravaged remains would have shattered the image of the boy king as a divine monarch. Instead, the empty coffin stood as a gilded symbol of power, untouched by decay, a silent acknowledgement that the brutal truths of mortality must be hidden from polite society. Inside the hidden vault, however, the real coffin waited, encrusted in layers of sealing wax and heavy shot, to suppress any further expansion of gases, and to prevent the coffin from rupturing under the pressure of internal putrefaction. After the ceremony, workers sealed the vault door with mortar and stone almost immediately. An official decree forbade any further access, insisting that Edward's remains rest in sanctified secrecy. Even so, rumours swirled for weeks of distant sacks of smell that wafted from beneath the abbey's floor, teasing the corridors of St. Margaret's Church with memories of the horror they sought to bury. Some guards claimed to hear faint, rhythmic thumps echoes of the body's last whispers, a final testament to the boy who had borne the weight of a kingdom on his frail shoulders. Thus the summer and autumn of 1553 passed in a haze of grief and guilt. Edward's real funeral was a clandestine affair, attended only by a handful of trusted courtiers and a small contingent of clergy sworn to silence. They recited the final prayers over the sealed coffins, their voices low and tremulous, as though the very act of speaking might summon the lingering spectre of the departed king. Outside, England mourned its lost sovereign in gilded emptiness, while the true cost of Henry VIII's dynastic ambitions lay entombed beneath layers of lead and lies, hidden from view but never quite forgotten. In the days following the 6th of July 1553, after the body of Prince Edward VI had slipped into silent stillness, the true horror of embalming and interment began. Embalmers, summoned in grim haste, pried open the prince's lead-lined coffin and lifted the heavy lid to reveal a sight that would haunt even the most seasoned mortuary hands. His lungs lay collapsed and sodden, soft as waterlogged sponges, their delicate tissue now a foul-smelling slurry. The liver, once a firm reddish-brown, crumbled at the gentlest touch, breaking apart like brittle sandstone under a gloved hand. The heart was grotesquely enlarged twice its normal size, and adhered firmly to the ribs by fibrous strands that had thickened and darkened over the boy's final weeks. Each organ threatened to disintegrate at the slightest handling, forcing the embalmers to work with extreme caution, using long spoons and wooden paddles to stir and lift the remains. In a desperate attempt to halt further decay, they packed the body cavities with vast quantities of aromatic spices, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and generous handfuls of natron salt, a substance prized for its preservative qualities. Lumps of myrrh and frankincense were shoved into every available cavity, their resinous scent clashing violently with the rotting odours that pressed outward from the prince's body. Yet as the hours wore on, the pressure of internal gases began to inflate the corpse once more, buffeting the embalmers with sudden expulsions of fetid air. Courtiers stationed as night guards later reported hearing faint bup-bup noises rattling against the coffin's lead walls, as if the prince were drawing one final dreadful breath. Realizing that the internal pressure threatened to rupture the seals, the court ordered that the body be enclosed in multiple nested coffins. First came a thick lead shell, intended to contain the stench and the gas. Around this, a solid oak coffin was fashioned, its polished surface bearing the Tudor arms. Finally, a second layer of lead was applied, pinhole drilled to allow minimal venting yet dense enough to hold in the sheer force of putrefactive gases. Then, wax seals were applied to every seam, and metal shot was sprinkled atop the lead to add weight and prevent expansion. Even so, some guards whispered of the occasional tremor, a shifting of the lead under unseen pressure, and the muffled echoes of the corpse's internal strife. Meanwhile, the public spectacle of mourning was carefully orchestrated to conceal these grim realities. The planned lying in state at Westminster Abbey was abruptly cancelled. In its stead, an empty oak coffin light enough for children to lift was draped in sumptuous crimson cloth and gold trim, placed at the abbey's entrance for the populace to pay respects. Behind closed doors in a secluded chapel, the true coffin lay hidden, accessible only to a select few. The Lord Chamberlain, the Dean of Westminster, and 2 representatives of the Privy Council, all sworn to absolute secrecy. On the 8th of August 1553, the formal interment took place. The ceremony was stripped of all but the most essential rites: a brief service at dawn, a handful of prayers whispered by candlelight, and the lowering of the lead-encased coffin into a tomb carved deep beneath the abbey floor. There was no grand procession, no final oration at the graveside, only the sound of mortar being applied to seal the vault. By nightfall, the crypt's entrance was sealed with fresh stone and a thick plaster mix, an unbroken barrier designed to hold in both the prince's remains and the scandal they represented. All documents related to the burial were promptly locked away in the Privy Council's archives. Receipts for spices and resins purchased from the Antwerp merchants were stamped Tudor privilege and filed under code numbers. Invoices for replacing floorboards, etched through by corrosive bodily fluids, were marked as emergency repairs and hidden behind layers of red wax seals. Even the royal purse accounts, which normally recorded expenditures with meticulous transparency, showed only the vaguest references to funerary costs, omitting any hint of the extraordinary measures taken to contain the transient horrors. In the official chronicles, The prince's passing was glossed over in a single serene line. The late King Edward was brought to his rest in holy peace. There was no mention of swollen limbs, of organs liquefied beyond recognition, or of the suffocating stench that lingered in Westminster's halls for days. The people were told only that their young sovereign had been laid to rest, with all due dignity, his memory preserved in stained glass and alabaster effigies that showed him as a serene boy standing tall, crown poised atop his head, an innocent smile upon his lips. Yet for those few who had witnessed the private rites, the burial was anything but dignified. They carried with them the echo of that dreadful bup-bup from within the sealed coffins, an indelible reminder that death does not always proceed quietly. Beneath the polished floors of Westminster Abbey, the true glory of the Tudor line lay in decay and deception, an agonizing secret bound by lead, oak, and endless layers of denial. And so the chamber doors were barred, candles extinguished, and the world went on, unaware that at its heart, the kingdom's greatest hope had been concealed in a buried chamber, shrouded by the very power that had once exulted in his birth. In the wake of Edward VI's death on the 6th of July 1553, the Tudor succession crisis ignited with startling immediacy. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had engineered the device for the succession, saw his grand design unravel within 9 fleeting days. His intent had been to bypass Edward's half-sisters, first Mary, then Elizabeth, and place Lady Jane Grey upon the throne. Yet, as word of Mary Tudor's imminent claims spread through the countryside, armed loyalists rallied to her banner, flooding London's streets with banners bearing her name. Jane's 9-day reign collapsed almost as quickly as it had been proclaimed, and Northumberland found himself arrested, charged with high treason. He was executed at the Tower of London, his head severed by the same axe that had felled so many of Henry's perceived enemies. But Northumberland was not alone in facing the grim consequences. Many courtiers and officials who had stood closest to Edward during his final months found themselves tainted by association with the prince's macabre end. Some, having witnessed the boy's body in various stages of decay or facilitated the embalming process, were accused of complicity in a cover-up and banished to distant manors or exiled across the Channel. Others met harsher fates, swift trials, ignominious executions, and the forfeiture of family lands and titles. Thus, the bloody clean-up following Edward's passing laid bare the fragility at the heart of Tudor authority. Henry VIII had sacrificed his faith, his marriages, and 2 queens' lives to secure a male heir, yet all that remained in his legacy was a sickly child and a fractured court. While the political fallout unfolded in a flurry of proclamations and executions, medical historians turned their gaze to deciphering the true cause of Edward's demise. The official medical registers of the Tudor court had long been shrouded in confidentiality, but scholars have since pieced together fragments from foreign dispatches and clandestine correspondence. The consensus among modern experts points squarely to miliary tuberculosis as the primary culprit. This form of tuberculosis, characterized by widespread dissemination of the bacterium through the bloodstream, would have explained the incessant night sweats, the chronic cough yielding blood-streaked phlegm, and the formation of multiple abscesses in the lungs and beyond. Compounding his plight was the likelihood of chronic kidney disease, suggested by persistent generalized edema anasarca and the accumulation of fluid in the abdominal cavity, known as ascites. Some researchers have proposed that Edward may also have harbored an inherited immunodeficiency, a subtle genetic flaw, rendering him especially susceptible to recurrent infections. In such a scenario, his rigorous bubble upbringing, daily fumigations, strict isolation, and the prohibition of contact with everyday pathogens may have denied his immune system the opportunity to develop resilience, leaving him defenseless when illness finally struck. Yet rumors of foul play persisted in diplomatic circles. Spies and ambassadors whispered of potential poisoning, speculating that arsenic or other toxic substances had been used to hasten Edward's decline. However, the prince's symptoms' progressive weight loss over years, the slow onset of multi-organ failure, and the consistency of his pulmonary complications align more convincingly with chronic tuberculosis than with any acutely administered toxin. Among surviving accounts, there is no single smoking gun to confirm or dispel theories of deliberate poisoning. Foreign envoys discreetly recorded their observations in margin notes and sketchy reports, noting only that Edward's condition resembled the wasting sickness rather than the sudden collapse typical of a lethal poison. Meanwhile, the Tudor court meticulously suppressed any mention of the prince's true condition in public annals. Official histories praised Edward as a steadfast religious reformer and a youth of remarkable wisdom, emphasizing his pious devotion to Protestant doctrine and his intellectual promise. Yet these laudatory titles masked the grim reality that the boy had spent his final years in a fevered haze, his body dissolving from within, his agency usurped by political machinations. The true nature of Edward's suffering emerged only in the private papers of aristocratic families and the coded dispatches of continental diplomats. In one such document, a French ambassador described the prince as a living skeleton, his face sunken and veined, his arms swollen like balloons. An Italian physician, whose identity remains uncertain, wrote in veiled Latin that Edward's lungs were but rotting sponges, and that the child king's desiccated organs cried out for mercy. Yet none of this made its way into the state-sanctioned narrative. Instead, Tudor propaganda focused on staging grand portraits of Edward in his youth paintings that depicted him with rosy cheeks and bright eyes, his slender hand extended in regal gesture, as though unfazed by any hint of frailty. Even the details of his embalming and burial were excised from the public record. Records of spice and resin purchases, large consignments of myrrh, cinnamon, and natron are found only in merchant logs in Antwerp, meticulously noting the quantities acquired for royal use. Bills for floorboard replacements, necessitated by the corrosive fluids that had seeped through Chester tiles in Edward's chambers, were erroneously coded as maintenance of King's Hall. The Privy Council minutes refer obliquely to urgent expenditures, without elaboration, while court diarists were instructed to record only the ceremonial aspects of the prince's funeral, with nary a hint of the ghastly undertakings that took place beneath the abbey floor. In the decades that followed, English chroniclers and clerics continued to refer to Edward as our youthful sovereign, taken too soon. A noble soul destined for greater deeds had his life not been cut short. Yet behind this sanitized epitaph lay a darker truth, known only to those who had glimpsed his final days. That the very throne meant to elevate the Tudor lineage had become the stage for an epic tragedy of disease, denial, and political desperation. The young prince's demise served as both a catalyst for the rapid restoration of Mary Tudor and as a damning testament to the perils of absolute power that could not even shield its lord from the relentless forces of infection and decay. In the end, the Tudor dynasty's most fervent hope became its greatest cautionary tale, a reminder that human life, however exalted, remains ever vulnerable to the slow, unrelenting advance of nature's most insidious afflictions. Under a cultural lens, the tragedy of Edward VI has long stood as a stark emblem of power's rot from within. For centuries, writers and artists have tiptoed around the more gruesome aspects of his final days, preferring to depict the boy king as a paragon of youthful devotion to the Christian faith rather than a living corpse decaying upon his throne. In formal histories and grand portraits, Edward is often shown in soft candlelight, his face serene, hands clasped in prayer, robes lustrous with gold thread, and yet the truth behind the canvas is far more unsettling. Ghostly hints of his macabre end do creep into darker corners of cultural expression. Gothic novelists of the 18th century, enthralled by the spectral and the uncanny, occasionally wove into their tales a reference to a silent heir, whose tomb wept no tears but exhaled a cold breath of despair. Their protagonists would wander through moonlit abbeys, hearing the faintest bup-bup echo beneath stone floors, a hollow reminder of a royal body in its eternal restlessness. Playwrights of the same era penned shadowed dramas in which the king's attendants, faces hidden by hoods, rearranged shrouds and whispered prayers in empty halls, only to be haunted by the memory of a boy whose flesh had betrayed him. The Romantic movement of the 19th century embraced the image of the rotting corpse as a powerful symbol of political and religious upheaval. Poets and painters drew comparisons between Edward's physical decay and the moral decay that attended the Tudor struggle for supremacy. In sweeping oil paintings, a crumbling coffin might lie beside a tattered Bible, or a plume of incense smoke might swirl around a cracked crown. Writers described the pallor of a king who had tasted the bile of ambition, and they paired his image with the storms and earthquakes that, in their view, shook the foundations of England's faith. Yet for all this cultural fascination, attempts to physically unearth Edward's remains for modern scientific scrutiny have been repeatedly thwarted. Over the centuries, scholars have petitioned to open his vault at Westminster Abbey in hopes of conducting DNA analysis that might reveal whether he carried a congenital immune disorder or a genetic predisposition to tuberculosis. Such findings could illuminate why he was so fragile from childhood, why he endured one infection after another, and why his body ultimately succumbed to the relentless progress of disease. For the Church of England and the British monarchy, however, the prospect of exhumation has remained a line they refuse to cross. Official statements cite the sacredness of royal remains and the diplomatic sensitivities of disturbing a resting sovereign. Behind the carefully worded refusals lies also a fear of exposing the monarchy's darkest chapter, a chapter that, once opened, might cast new shadows on the Tudor narrative. Some court officials whisper that the scandal of revealing further evidence of the prince's decay of putrefaction so advanced that even the lead coffins could not contain it would tarnish the crown's dignity in the eyes of the world. Modern geneticists argue that a simple swab of bone or a remnant of preserved tissue could transform our understanding of the Tudor era. By identifying specific mutations in genes responsible for immune function, they could confirm or refute theories of an inherited susceptibility to infection. Such knowledge might even offer insights into the broader history of human disease, tracing patterns of tuberculosis across centuries and continents. Yet the vault door remains sealed, its stone blocking not only the body below, but also any chance of reconciliation between historical mystery and scientific possibility. Despite these barriers, the cultural resonance of Edward's story has only deepened in contemporary media. Documentaries on streaming platforms feature experts debating the ethics of royal exhumation, intercut with CGI reconstructions of the boy king in his final hours, his skin ghostly pale, lungs clotted, veins pulsing beneath translucent flesh. Graphic novels have reimagined his chambers as haunted spaces, where the walls themselves seem to weep with moisture and the smell of decay hangs heavy in the air. Even video games set in reimagined Tudor courts include nods to the prince's demise, using his chamber as a puzzle location, its walls scored with cryptic symbols left by those who sought to preserve or conceal his legacy. This cultural tapestry, woven with threads of reverence and horror, underscores a paradox. The more Edward's physical suffering is sensationalized, the more his spiritual and historical footprint seems to grow. He has become, in effect, a martyr of power's excess, an innocent figure consumed by the ambitions of others, his body a vessel for larger narratives of faith, succession, and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. Even as debates rage over whether to disturb his tomb, Edward VI's legacy endures as both inspiration and warning. He stands at the crossroads of myth and medicine, of religious zeal and political expedience. His story beckons us to look beyond polished chronicles and hallowed ceremonies, to face the unsettling truths of mortality and the price exacted when human governance ignores the frailty of the flesh. In the hush of Westminster Abbey, where stone cherubs hover over silent vaults, his name may be spoken with reverence or not at all. The Abbey's quiet corridors bear no plaques to his suffering, no inscriptions to his slow demise. Yet the cultural echoes of his short life, captured in verse, in paint, and in whispered rumour, remind us that even a child king can become a symbol far larger than his years. His body, locked away and undisturbed, continues to fuel the imaginations of artists and the debates of historians, emblematic of power's corruption and the enduring human fascination with both decay and redemption. In that tension, Edward's story will reverberate through the ages, a lullaby of sorrow for sleep-bound scholars and a cautionary hush for those who hold authority too close to the pulse of humanity. In medical terms, the case of Edward VI stands as an invaluable archive of Tudor-era medicine, a tragic chapter that continues to inform modern doctors about the limits and missteps of pre-modern therapies. Contemporary scholars have painstakingly deciphered the prince's surviving medical notes, handwritten marginalia, and fragmented journal entries to reconstruct the course of his illnesses and the therapeutic interventions that both prolonged and aggravated his suffering. The earliest detailed account comes from Dr. John Keyes, one of the prince's primary physicians. In his faded script, Caius described ulcerations that penetrated deeply into Edward's flesh, noting how the edges of the wounds were blackened and ragged, oozing a foul discharge that stained all linens it touched. He recorded with clinical detachment the tortured screams of the boy as he endured daily dressings, writing that the air itself becomes contaminated with such a stench that even the most stalwart of attendants must turn away. Away. Dr. Christopher Langton later introduced a theory that resonated with modern immunology. Langton hypothesized that Edward's antibodies were stunted by the antiseptic confinements of his environment, suggesting that the prince's rigid isolation, daily fumigations, walls scrubbed with lime, and a prohibition on interaction with common folk may have prevented his immune system from developing robust defenses. In Langton's view, the very measures taken to shield Edward from contagion ultimately left him defenseless against the pathogens that did infiltrate his chamber, a concept that presaged the 20th century understanding of hygiene hypothesis in pediatric immunology. Perhaps the most famous assessment came from Girolamo Cardano, a renowned Italian polymath summoned to court in 1552. Cardano conducted a private examination of the prince, observing signs of systemic wasting and chronic pulmonary distress. In a letter preserved in the archives of Milan's Biblioteca Ambrosiana, he prognosticated that Edward's life expectancy did not exceed 2 or 3 years following his initial consultation. Cardano's candor, rare among court physicians who generally towed the line of optimism, lent credibility to the notion that the boy king's decline was inexorable. Modern physicians have revisited these historical descriptions with a clinical eye. The hollow greenish hue, Langton and Caius noted, corresponds closely with cyanosis, a symptom of severely compromised pulmonary function. The blue veins visible through thin skin point to chronic hypoxia and edema fluid accumulation, consistent with heart and kidney failure. Ruptured pulmonary abscesses, as recorded by Caius, align with findings of miliary tuberculosis, a form of the disease in which mycobacteria spread via the bloodstream to multiple organs, creating innumerable tiny lesions that resemble millet seeds under microscopic examination. Many Tudor physicians, confronted with such relentless suffering and the grotesque decomposition they witnessed during embalming, retired in shock or abandoned service at court, unable to bear the memory of the prince's final days. Accounts of their departures appear sporadically in pension records and private letters. Dr. Lawrence Miles resigned in fear of his own life, while Surgeon Edmund Plowden requested leave of absence, citing nightmares of flesh and bone undone. Even attendants who directly cared for Edward, those tasked with changing his linens, cleansing his festering wounds, and enduring the stench that permeated his chambers, vanished from official household rolls, their names erased as though by decree of silence. Their absence from the records only deepens the aura of mystery that surrounds the prince's demise. From a modern therapeutic standpoint, Edward's prognosis, had he lived in an era of antibiotics and advanced supportive care, would have been far more hopeful. A regimen of isoniazid and rifampicin, powerful anti-tubercular agents, could have halted the progression of his miliary infection. Nutritional support, delivered intravenously or via feeding tubes, might have corrected the severe malnourishment that weakened his body's resilience. Renal dialysis could have mitigated the effects of his chronic kidney disease, preventing the dangerous accumulation of fluid and toxins that contributed to his systemic failure. Supportive therapies such as oxygen supplementation, mechanical ventilation, and analgesics would have eased his breathing and alleviated pain, transforming his final months from a prolonged agony into a more manageable decline. Alas, 16th century medicine knew none of these interventions. Instead, the prevailing therapeutic arsenal consisted of practices that modern clinicians recognize as not only ineffective, but often harmful. Bloodletting, intended to purge excess humours, bled him of precious red cells, and further weakened his already feeble frame. The application of caustic ointments and blistering plasters, used to draw out supposed toxins, inflicted additional tissue damage, creating new wounds that demanded care and risked infection. Mercury compounds, administered in hopes of purgation, damaged his kidneys and nervous system. Antimony treatments, a staple of Renaissance pharmacopoeia, induced violent vomiting and diarrhea, exacerbating his dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. In the harsh reality of Tudor medicine, the prince's condition was both observed and recorded with a degree of precision that astonishes modern historians yet the available treatments were rooted in theory rather than empirical success. The richly detailed clinical notes, painstakingly transcribed and now painstakingly analysed, reveal a pattern of iatrogenic harm, interventions that compounded his suffering even as they sought to alleviate it. Each recorded dosage of a toxic compound, each notation of a new burn from a heated poultice, speaks to a tragic era in which the line between cure and cruelty was perilously thin. Despite the grotesque mistreatment by contemporary standards, Edward's case contributed to the slow evolution of medical understanding. The vivid descriptions of his tuberculosis, so frequent and so well documented, helped later physicians recognize patterns of progressive respiratory compromise and multi-organ involvement. As sedation techniques and antiseptic protocols emerged in later centuries, the lessons gleaned from Edward's plight informed the gradual abandonment of bloodletting and caustic applications in favor of more humane, evidence-based interventions. Today, the prince's medical dossier remains a cornerstone for scholars studying pre-modern disease. It stands as a testament to the potency of detailed clinical observation, however flawed the therapies, showing that careful recording of symptoms, progression, and response to treatment can transcend centuries. In lecture halls and medical journals, Edward's story is cited as an early case study of miliary tuberculosis, complicated by renal and cardiac failure. His legacy, far from merely a footnote in royal chronicle, enriches our collective understanding of human pathology and the profound impact of environment, genetics, and therapeutic culture on disease outcomes. In the hush of modern hospital wings, where patients receive targeted antibiotics and supportive care, it is sobering to remember how differently the world cared for a young king scarcely more than 4 centuries ago. Edward VI's suffering, diligently recorded by his physicians and now passed by modern experts, underscores both the advancements of medicine and the indelible importance of compassion. For while our tools have changed, the fundamental lesson of his tragedy endures: that careful observation must be paired with effective, humane treatment, lest the victim's plight become another chapter of medical history's sorrowful litany. The spiritual legacy and commemoration of Edward VI endured for centuries after the boy king's tragic passing. In official histories and grand portraits, he was clothed in the mantle of martyrdom, a royal saint, whose pure heart and steadfast faith in God stood as a beacon for Protestant England. Church annals praised him as a paragon of piety, a young sovereign who embraced divine purpose until his final breath. Woodcuts and oil paintings produced after his death softened or erased any trace of his pulmonary afflictions or the hideous marks of decomposition. In these depictions, his skin is smooth and alabaster, his gaze bright, as though he had never known the crushing weight of illness. Clerics, delivering sermons on feast days in his honor, spoke of his soul ascending to heaven, interceding on behalf of the Tudor dynasty, and shielding the realm from looming calamity. Yet beneath this curated veneer, folk traditions preserved more unsettling memories. In whispered tales along village hearths, the young king's spirit was said to haunt the stone corridors of Westminster Abbey. Some claimed to hear faint, sorrowful moans drifting through the night air, or to smell a sudden, ghostly whiff of decay when the moon rode high. Old legends told of a pale figure drifting past columns and cloisters, its robes trailing like mist, pausing at sealed doorways where vaults concealed ancient secrets. Children dared one another to creep to the churchyard after midnight to glimpse the phantom prince, though most fled at the first echo of hollow footsteps. These stories, passed down in hushed tones, kept alive the memory of Edward's true suffering, even as official records celebrated only his sanctity. In the years following the Elizabethan era, poets of the post-Renaissance period seized upon Edward's story as a potent metaphor for the decline of unchecked power. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, verses circulated that juxtaposed the purity of his youthful devotion with the moral decay of political intrigue. Jacobean playwrights, too, wove references to a blood-tinted boy king into dark tragedies, using masked characters and secretive palace settings to allude to his bloated body and the stench that even the most lavish incense could not hide. One notorious drama described a scene in which courtiers, their costumes dyed deep crimson to symbolize royal blood, recoiled in horror as they laid bare a throne chamber drenched in symbolic filth. Audiences, seated under flickering candlelight, would shiver as actors mimed the splintering of bones and the oozing of putrid fluids, all without ever naming Edward directly. In the 17th century, a formal excavation of the prince's tomb was proposed, ostensibly for the sake of scholarly inquiry. A royal commission obtained permission to open a small section of the crypt, hoping to examine the remains and perhaps confirm aspects of the official narrative. But the venture was abruptly aborted after a single night. Those entrusted with the exhumation reportedly encountered indescribable horrors: organs in ruinous disarray, bones softened by decay, and an overwhelming miasma that drove several men to collapse in terror. The commission's records were swiftly sealed, correspondence burned, and participants sworn to silence. Only a few fragmentary notes survived, hidden in private archives, hinting at discoveries deemed too shocking for public acknowledgement. Despite these cultural and theatrical allusions, the academic study of Edward's decomposition advanced only slowly. It was not until the 20th century that scholars began to decode original manuscripts. Dr. John Keyes's detailed notes on ulcerated flesh, Dr. Christopher Langton's hypothesis of immune deficiency due to sterile confinement, and the celebrated polymath Gerolamo Cardano's grim prognosis that the prince would live no more than 2 or 3 years beyond his examination in 1552. Modern physicians analyzing these descriptions of greenish, bruised skin, veins standing out like ropes beneath thin tissue, ruptured pulmonary abscesses, and systemic edema causing intestinal cramping, have confidently diagnosed Edward with miliary tuberculosis compounded by chronic renal failure and congestive heart insufficiency. These retrospective diagnoses, grounded in precise Renaissance observations, underscore the extraordinary value of Tudor medical records as a case study in early prevalence and pathology of infectious disease. Concurrently, geneticists and anthropologists have lobbied for access to the prince's remains, hoping that a simple sampling of bone or preserved tissue could reveal an inherited mutation affecting immune function. In theory, such molecular evidence might confirm whether Edward's recurrent infections stemmed from a congenital immunodeficiency. Yet every proposal to open the vault has been met with steadfast royal and ecclesiastical opposition. Official statements from the Church of England and the British Crown cite the sacrosanct nature of royal sepulchres and the potential diplomatic ramifications of disturbing a sovereign's tomb. Beneath these public rationales, however, lies an unspoken concern that unearthing further evidence of the prince's ghastly decline would irrevocably tarnish the monarchy's historical image. Nonetheless, Edward's story continues to captivate popular culture. Streaming service documentaries on horror history routinely feature dramatized reenactments of his final hours, complete with CGI, rendered lesions weeping putrid fluid and stifling chambers echoing with ragged coughs. Graphic novels offer unflinching panels depicting his corpse in various stages of decay, skin splitting open, viscous humours dripping onto the cobblestones of the chapel floor, and embalmers battling to contain the noxious vapours with swaths of fragrant linen. These vivid portrayals, though controversial for their explicitness, provide a visceral connection to the past, allowing modern audiences to confront what sanitized histories obscure. In the end, the remnants of Edward VI's physical deterioration have shaped our understanding of the Tudor era more profoundly than any courtly chronicle. His laboured breathing, likened by contemporary witnesses to the groan of ancient elephants trudging through a dying forest, became a living metaphor for the corruption at the heart of absolute power. The contrast between his youthful image as a holy prince and the grim reality of his corporeal disintegration reveals the duality of monarchy itself, outwardly resplendent, yet inwardly susceptible to the inexorable forces of biology and human ambition. As monarchs and ministers rise and fall upon the shifting tides of politics, the silent tomb of Edward VI remains a poignant reminder that even the most exalted throne cannot withstand the intimate truths written in flesh. In the eyes of modern historians, Edward VI emerges not merely as a tragic victim of relentless disease, but as a sacrificial pawn in the ruthless political game of the Tudor court. Henry VIII clung to his throne with unyielding determination, sacrificing faith, marriage alliances, and even the well-being of his own offspring to secure his dynasty. The young prince was thus elevated into an object lesson. If Edward thrived, it would signal Tudor permanence. If he faltered, it would portend the dynasty's downfall. Yet the very measures intended to preserve his life, an extreme regimen of isolation and antisepsis, deprived him of the chance to develop natural immunity. In effect, Edward was reared within a sterile glass sphere, shielded from ordinary exposures that train a healthy immune system. By severing all contact with the microbial world outside the palace walls, his caretakers unwittingly weakened his nascent defenses, ensuring that when illness finally struck, it would find an unguarded, vulnerable host. From 1550 to 1553, the prince's court physicians employed a bewildering array of contradictory treatments. They followed the ancient practice of sanguine removal, bleeding him repeatedly to rebalance his humours and unblock meridians, even as his body wasted away. Plasters of heated herbal poultices, intended to draw out the so-called bad humours, left his skin blistered and inflamed. Mercurial compounds and antimony were administered in tonic draughts, believed to purge the blood of toxins, but, in reality, imposing further stress on his failing liver and kidneys. Each intervention compounded the prince's suffering, draining precious vitality from his frail form. Modern medical scholars view these treatments as emblematic of 16th century medicine's perilous limitations. Despite access to some of Europe's oldest medical texts, and the best minds from Italy and France, Tudor physicians lacked any true understanding of bacteria, antiseptics, or effective therapeutics. Instead, they relied on ritual and ancient theory, inadvertently accelerating the prince's decline. Politically, Edward's death in July 1553 precipitated a maelstrom of succession and religious upheaval that reverberated throughout England. Upon his passing, Mary Tudor, Edward's elder half-sister, moved swiftly to claim the throne as Mary I, a monarch whose fervent Catholic convictions earned her the sobriquet Bloody Mary. Her ascendancy marked the onset of a brutal campaign against Protestant reformers, reversing her brother's nascent efforts to solidify the Anglican Church. The English Reformation, which Edward had championed with youthful zeal, was violently curtailed as Mary's forces burned heretics at the stake and enforced strict adherence to papal authority. Chroniclers of the era lament that had Edward lived even a few years more, his measured reforms and scholarly dedication might have entrenched Protestantism more firmly, sparing England the bloodletting that followed under Mary's reign. This speculation has become a recurrent theme among scholars, who dub Edward's premature death the closing of a door in history, a pivotal moment that shifted the nation away from a more moderate, enduring reformation toward decades of persecution and instability. In the centuries since, Edward has been portrayed by historians and biographers as the embodiment of both promise and fragility. His short reign was marked by earnest proclamations for prayer and scripture, yet his youth and ill health rendered him a figurehead for more seasoned statesmen. Regency councils, led first by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, wielded true power, shaping policy in the boy's name while monitoring his every breath. After Edward's passing, Somerset was executed for treason, and Northumberland met his own grim fate for his attempt to install Lady Jane Grey as his successor. These dramatic reversals underscored the perilous nature of Tudor politics, where ambition could elevate or extinguish lives in a heartbeat. Today, Edward VI's legacy occupies a unique place in historical discourse. He is remembered as an icon of unfulfilled potential, a sleepy sovereign celebrated for his piety and quiet intellect, yet doomed by the very precautions meant to preserve him. His death and the turmoil that ensued has been read as a cautionary tale about the interplay of power, faith, and scientific ignorance. In academic circles, articles and monographs explore how his isolationist upbringing may have deprived him of vital immunological resilience, while political treatises debate the lost opportunities of his intended religious reforms. The question that lingers is whether England might have evolved differently under a healthy King Edward, one who might have bridged the deep divides between Catholic and Protestant factions, fostering a more gradual, less violent path toward religious settlement. In museums and libraries, Edward's story continues to draw fascination. Portraits showcasing a serene, luminous boy contrast sharply with the fragmentary medical notes detailing boils, abscesses, and shattered ribs. Visitors pore over manuscripts that record the quantity of rosewater used to fumigate his chambers, or the expense ledgers for Turkish myrrh and spices smuggled in for embalming. These textual relics merge with the hushed legends of ghostly footsteps in the abbey, reinforcing Edward's status as both a royal martyr and spectral presence in England's haunted past. Ultimately, Edward VI stands as a spectral bridge between the medieval world of humoral theory and the nascent dawn of scientific inquiry. He embodies the tensions of an age struggling to reconcile faith with reason, authority with compassion, and tradition with innovation. His short, painful life, and the political earthquake that followed his death, offer modern scholars a prism through which to examine the complex forces that shaped Tudor England. And as historians continue to sift through private letters, coded dispatches, and clandestine recommendations, the prince's legacy remains as poignant as ever. A delicate reminder that the greatest hopes of a dynasty can rest upon the most vulnerable of shoulders, and that the care we take, or fail to take, with our youngest and weakest can echo through generations like a soft, persistent whisper in the corridors of time. Financial records from the final months of Edward VI's life paint a striking portrait of a court gripped by panic and obsession. Ledgers note vast sums spent on imported incense, frankincense from the Levant, myrrh from the Red Sea coast, and costly benzoin resin from Sumatra, each purchase totaling dozens of pounds sterling, a fortune in the mid-16th century. Spices and herbs flowed in from across Europe, cinnamon bark from the Spice Islands, cloves from the Moluccas, and camphor from the Far East, all marshalled to mask the stench that no amount of perfumed smoke seemed able to dispel. Bills for specialized anti-decubitus mattresses, fabrics woven with linen, and stuffed with aromatic stuffing to prevent pressure sores sit alongside invoices for camphoric oils and scented ointments meant to staunch the weeping. Ulcers. Every entry in the royal purse was stamped highest confidentiality, hidden from routine scrutiny. Together, these expenditures attest to the Tudor court's frantic efforts to sustain the prince's life and conceal the mounting horror from public view. Beneath these medical expenditures lay a darker layer of political intrigue. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, manoeuvred ceaselessly to secure his influence over the throne. He forced the debilitated Edward to sign the Device for the Succession, a document intended to bar the king's half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from inheriting and instead elevate Lady Jane Grey to sovereign status. Couriers were dispatched to bring Edward charcoal black oak writing boxes and fine quills, so that even in his edematous state he might appear to wield the quill of authority. In the prince's dimly lit chamber, overhead torches flickering across damp stone walls, Northumberland and his secretaries guided Edward's swollen hand to the parchment. Letters that had once been neat and upright dissolved into blurred smears. Ink pooled around swollen fingers, staining cuffs and parchment alike. From firm strokes meant to convey royal command, the signature devolved into a shaky scrawl, indiscernible to all but the most patient observers. This signature of the dying, a combination of coercion and physical frailty, remains only in a single surviving facsimile held in a private aristocratic archive, a testament to power prioritized over humanity. In Edward's final hours, envoys were summoned not to offer comfort, but to attest that the king still lived, for only a living sovereign could validate royal edicts. Even as his body betrayed him, his office was treated as a machine still running, and every feeble breath registered as proof of political continuity. The pseudo-will that emerged from this spectacle stands as a chilling symbol of authority's descent into moral abdication, when preserving the throne trumps the sanctity of a child's life and dignity. Yet, amid the swirl of courtly machinations, Edward's spiritual yearnings shone through the darkness. In his last surviving journal entries written in a cramped, trembling hand, he turned repeatedly to the Book of Job for solace. He penned, "My flesh decays day by day, yet my spirit must stay steadfast for God and for the future of England." These lines, discovered scrawled on slips of parchment hidden in a monastic trove, were later recopied by devout scribes into Protestant martyrologies. Edward's words became an inspiration for fledgling Anglican congregations, quoted from pulpits as evidence of youthful piety and divine purpose. Despite these poignant religious affirmations, the grotesque reality of Edward's physical decay was treated with reticence in formal medical literature. Most English medical textbooks from the 17th century onward mention only that he died of the king's evil, a euphemism for tuberculosis, and omit any reference to the horrors of his embalming or the fluid-soaked dressings pressed against his ulcers. In contrast, a handful of specialized theses and peer-reviewed articles in medical history journals delve into the minutiae of his disintegration. These works, often illustrated with reconstructed diagrams, detail the progressive stages of miliary tuberculosis, from the earliest subcutaneous nodules and bluish-green discolorations, through the widespread rupture of pulmonary abscesses, to the final systemic edema that rendered his limbs grotesquely bloated. Such academic treatments remain confined to niche publications, far removed from mainstream textbooks, preserving only in specialist circles the raw truth of what lay beneath the royal garb. Thus, the financial, political, and religious dimensions of Edward's last months coalesce into a singular narrative of desperation. The Tudor court's lavish outlays for incense, spices, and specialized bedding stand in stark contrast to the young king's frailty, revealing a realm willing to spend a king's ransom to stave off biological decay. The coerced will, signed by trembling hand, underscores how political expedience subsumed personal agency, and Edward's own journal entries testify to a soul seeking meaning in suffering, a final act of spiritual resistance against the forces that had turned his body into a casualty of ambition. In the end, Edward's short life and death serve as a poignant parable for the intersection of power, faith, and medicine. They remind us that, even in an age of gold-embroidered robes and grand cathedral shrines, human flesh remains inexorably subject to disease. They warn that the mightiest of courts, armed with silver vials and velvet drapes, may still be powerless before the slow, patient advance of infection. And they suggest that beneath the glittering surface of monarchic pageantry, there often lies a deeper story of vulnerability, sacrifice, and the quiet courage of a boy who faced extraordinary trials with a steadfast heart. In this tapestry of ledgers and parchments, of smeared ink and whispered prayers, Edward VI's legacy endures as a hushed lullaby, a reminder that the price of power may sometimes be measured in a child's final, gasping breath. Looking back nearly 5 centuries later, the story of Edward VI stands not merely as a chronicle of one child's suffering, but as a tragic memoir of the Tudor dynasty itself. The prince's ordeal was an inevitable outcome when politics and prestige eclipse the sanctity of life, when power is guarded at any cost, even if that cost is the slow death of a boy. In their quest to perpetuate a golden age, the Tudors fashioned a royal citizen, encased in a sterile shell, a boy so protected that he was paradoxically abandoned to isolation and vulnerability. Edward was nurtured in what amounted to a glass womb, a protectorate of scented waters and fumigation fires, but that very protection severed him from the world's ordinary microbes, leaving him without the natural inoculations that sustain health. From a cultural perspective, Edward VI has become the enduring emblem of rot from within, a metaphor for authoritarian regimes that cloak their decay in gilded veneers. His corpse, locked in lead and hidden from view, has been grafted onto art and literature as a potent symbol of institutional corruption. In oil paintings, the immaculate figure of a boy in royal finery is juxtaposed with faint shadows at the corners of his eyes, or a subliminal hint of green pallor, suggesting something sinister beneath the surface. Writers have employed his tale to illustrate how the grandest of thrones can conceal the foulest truths, embedding allegories of a decaying kingdom within their prose. Even today, scholars in fields as diverse as political history, medical anthropology, and genetics examine Edward's case as a cautionary example of the intersection between political ambition and biomedical reality, teaching us, above all, that human lives must never be sacrifices to the altar of power. Despite the partial unveiling of Tudor medical records and correspondence, many mysteries remain locked away. Fragments of DNA perhaps lingering in the acidic soils of the king's chapel, or in residual fibers of his burial shroud, have yet to be sampled. Some diplomatic letters that once detailed the court's hush-hush expenditures on resins and salts have vanished, their archives pruned of inconvenient truths. The Tudor political stage, where ambition, faith, and bloodlines clashed in a final great drama, remains only partially reconstructed, its actors and motives obscured by time and purposeful erasure. We still wonder what fate might have befallen Edward had he received modern medical care. Would antibiotics have quelled the tuberculosis that ravaged his lungs? Could dialysis have alleviated his failing kidneys? Would nutritional support have spared him the gaunt appearance that has become synonymous with his memory? The unanswered question of Edward's second chance, of what he might have achieved under proper treatment, continues to animate scholarly debate. Some historians posit that he could have matured into a visionary monarch, cementing the English Reformation with greater consensus and avoiding the bloody reprisals under Mary's reign. Others argue that the same forces that beset his youth political rivals, religious zealots, superstitious courtiers, would have found new means to thwart his rule, inevitably subjecting him to further tribulations. Yet the very posing of these hypotheticals underscores the lasting power of his brief life. A meditation on contingency, on how the smallest hinge can swing the course of history. In the end, Edward VI's most tangible legacy lies in those Tudor medical annals and in the tabulated ledgers of sumptuous spices and fragrant woods. These are the pages that silently testify to his agony lines of figures denoting pounds sterling expended, columns of weights and measures for myrrh and cinnamon, entries marked top secret, royal infirmary supplies, all hinting at the frantic attempts to stave off putrefaction. Beyond statistics, however, are the countless folk legends that persist in whispered warnings, of pale spectres drifting through abbey corridors, of a faint chorus of coughs echoing beneath the midnight moon, and of the dreadful bup-bup that some swear still resonates from the sealed vaults. The Tudor era, with its brilliance and its tragedies, taught the world that no throne, no matter how gilded, can escape the fundamental law of birth, aging, sickness and death. Edward VI's sealed lead casket stands as a silent monument to this truth. His story reminds us that political edifices, like human bodies, are subject to internal decay, and that concealing symptoms does not heal disease. In that quiet sepulchre beneath Westminster Abbey, the legacy of a boy king endures not only in history books but in the soft, persistent echo of human vulnerability, a lullaby of mortality that lulls us to reflection long after the final candle has guttered out. And so we draw the curtains gently on this chapter of history, allowing the echoes of a boy king's quiet suffering to settle softly into the stillness of our thoughts. In slowing our pace and breathing in the hush that follows, we discover that this tale, so often told with clamour and detail, holds its true power in moments of reflection. We learn that unchecked ambition can cast a long, lingering shadow over even the brightest hopes, and that the most precious lives may be hidden behind gilded facades and whispered secrets. Yet there is comfort here as well, for in tracing Edward's fragile journey, we come to understand the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of compassion in the face of suffering. By holding space for the vulnerabilities of a 5-year-old dynasty's heir, we remind ourselves that power is never absolute, and that every throne, even one draped in velvet and gold, is subject to the inevitable rhythms of birth, decay, and renewal. Our hearts grow softer when we recognize how isolation can harm as much as disease, and how connection with community, with caregivers, with faith can bring solace when all else falters. As the final image of a sealed lead coffin drifts away like morning mist, we invite a gentle stillness to settle over our minds. May this story's hushed truths inspire us to cherish every fragile life, to seek understanding before judgment, and to remember that even the most burdened soul deserves kindness. Now, allow your eyelids to grow heavy, your breath to slow, and let these reflections fade into a peaceful whisper.